Okay, it looks like we have the feed streaming live now. So once again, I'm Chris Simmons. I'm president of the Broomfield Open Space Foundation, and we're very happy to present the speaker series along with the City and County of Broomfield Open Space and Trails. This is a series that happens in the spring and the fall, and today our focus is on owls. The Owls of Colorado. We have Emily Davenport here today. She's with Nature's Educators. Nature's Ed is a 501(c) nonprofit organization with a mission to elevate and care and protect wildlife by fostering memorable connections that inspire our community. And they've been providing state-recognized educational outreach programming in Colorado and neighboring states since 2008. They also opened their wildlife hospital and rehabilitation center last year. Emily has been a champion for wildlife and the environment for over a decade. She founded Rocky Mountain Wildlife Alliance in 2017, which then merged with Nature's Educators in 2019. She currently serves as the co-executive director for Nature's Educators and additionally serves as vice president on the board of the Echo Wildlife. Emily has worked with Colorado Wildlife for over 10 years, with her area of expertise being birds of prey. She has worked with thousands of raptors in her career, including the endangered California condor. Emily earned her Bachelor's of Fine Arts in Illustration from Rocky Mountain College of Art and Design, where her focus was on veterinary and medical illustration. And I'm really excited to have her here today. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Emily, and let you have the stage.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for that introduction, Chris. Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Davenport, and I think we'll just jump right into it and learn about some fun owl stuff today.
Yeah, and I will add one thing. I forgot to mention that we do have a Q&A feature down at the bottom of your screen for anyone who has a question to ask. Go ahead and use that Q&A feature. I will try, if it seems exactly relevant, to get the answered quickly. Otherwise, we'll have some time at the end so that I can get up to all your questions, and I'll be monitoring it. So please just use that Q&A feature, and I'll get the questions over.
Sounds perfect. Thank you. Yep, this is going to be an interactive presentation tonight, so please don't be shy. Please ask your questions as we go. And I am going to go ahead and share my presentation. All right. Can everybody see that okay? Mm-hmm. All right. Yay. All right, you guys. Well, again, thank you, Chris, for the introduction. Thank you guys for having me. Tonight we're going to learn about all the different owl species that we get here in Colorado because we're really lucky. We get so many cool species, so we're going to talk about those. Chris already introduced me, so I'm not going to go over any of this stuff. Now you guys know who I am and why the heck I'm here presenting to you guys tonight. As he mentioned, Nature's Educators, we're a nonprofit organization, and our goal really is to elevate the care and protection of wildlife, and we do that through education, collaboration, and rehabilitation. So we really like to say we are for people, for professionals, and for wildlife. That's really what we're all about. For those of you that don't know, we're going to spend a couple minutes talking about wildlife rehabilitation. What the heck is wildlife rehabilitation anyway? Well, it's the professional care of sick, injured, and orphaned wildlife with the goal to release them back into the wild, to their native habitat. Patients are only held in captivity for as long as needed until they are able to independently care for themselves and go back into the wild. Every effort is made on our part to make sure we minimize human contact and prevent taming, prevent habituation, that sort of thing, because that would not bode well for our friends once we release them back into the wild. We have to work closely with veterinarians to assess injuries, provide first aid to wild animals, as well as diagnose a variety of illnesses and provide physical therapy to those animals that come into our rehab center. We also have to have an extensive knowledge base about the species in care, the age of the animals that we have in care, including their natural history, what they eat, what they do they migrate, that sort of thing. All those nutritional requirements, behavioral requirements, as well as what kind of caging do they need to be in while they're in captivity. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing, unfortunately. In order to be a wildlife rehabilitator, you have to have a state license, and in many cases, if you're doing birds, you have to have a federal license as well, which I carry. And then we really try and be a community resource. That's why we're doing what we're doing tonight, is to be out into our community, talking to you guys about things that we are passionate about, in hopes that you guys will do the same with us if you ever need that resource. I take a bit of a different approach to wildlife rehab. Sometimes a wildlife rehabilitator may say the most important issue that they address is the individual, the health of that individual. And that's really important, but here at Nature's Educators, we actually take a three-prong approach to rehabilitating wildlife. We're certainly gonna focus on that native wild animal that comes into our care, but we're also gonna consider the population as a whole, and also the ecosystem health. What are those animals going to do health-wise for the ecosystem if we release them back into the wild? So we are really thinking of all sorts of different things all at once when animals come into our rehabilitation center for care. And why is wildlife rehabilitation important? You know, I wanted to touch on some of these key facts this afternoon, or this evening, I should say, because we're going to touch on wildlife rehab throughout this presentation tonight, because a lot of the reasons that wildlife comes into our care is due to human reasons. So in Colorado alone, 95% of all the injured and orphaned animals that we receive into our wildlife hospital or our rehab center are due to either accidental or intentional human causes. So those are those anthropogenic reasons, like birds being hit by cars or colliding with windows, or animals being shot or hit by car, things like that, that are all sometimes preventable and then other times not so preventable. And so we'll talk a little bit about that this evening. Raptors in particular are on a steep decline. The Peregrine Fund did a study a couple years ago that showed the raptor population worldwide is declining by 52%. Some groups of raptors, like vultures, are declining at a 90% rate. Really scary. So we're paying close attention to that. Wildlife rehabilitators are also important because we're often the first to spot disease outbreaks. Believe it or not, a wildlife rehabilitator was the first person to notice West Nile virus in the United States. It was actually a rehabber in New Jersey. And so we sometimes monitor these circumstances that sometimes evade the scientific community. Because we're taking in these large number of animals, we can start to see patterns that sometimes others can't see. We can also sometimes see pollution hotspots if we see animals that are coming in poisoned or having toxin issues. We can also monitor some of those other circumstances as well. Intensive rehab, of course, has helped save one of my favorite species, the California condor, but also bald eagles, the black-footed ferret, the boreal toad. Intensive rehab is such a critical part of conservation today. So it's not just about squirrels and rabbits and things like that, or red-tailed hawks. It's a bigger, broader picture worldwide, truly. We've also been integral in helping slow the spread of rabies in outbreak areas, primarily in the Midwest. We can see, again, because we're taking these large numbers of animals into our care, we can start to see a pattern, which is really important. We've also been instrumental in getting lead shot banned federally in wildlife refuges. And sometimes, most importantly, wildlife rehab is so important because when those animals cannot be released back into the wild, we have to do the most humane thing for them. And sometimes that means humanely ending their suffering. So lots of important things there. Okay, so I talked to you a little bit about wildlife rehabilitation. So what the heck is a bird of prey exactly? So I like to define this a little bit before we jump right into owls, because sometimes people are like, are they a bird of prey? Are they a raptor? What's going on here? So let's talk about that a little bit. So what exactly is a bird of prey? Well, they've got that big sharp beak for tearing flesh. These guys are meat eaters. They're not going to be eating carrots and grass and things like that. These guys are true carnivores. They're obligate carnivores. So that means they have to eat meat. So they have that beak for tearing. They have those big eyes that are oftentimes on the forward front part of their head. At Nature's Educators, we like to say eyes on the front, made to hunt. Eyes on the side, made to hide. And so you can really see that these birds are true predators, which is really cool. Then, of course, their wings. Most of these raptors or birds of prey, we use that word interchangeably, have big, strong, powerful flight muscles. Some use those wings for soaring. Others use those wings, like the falcon in the middle there, for cutting and maneuvering through the air. So they really have to be true athletes. We talked about the pointy end on the top of the bird. At the bottom of the bird, on their feet, they have their talons. So those talons, you can kind of think of them like the forks for the bird, where their beak is like the knife, kind of. So they're using those talons to grasp their prey, grip it, hold on to it, in some cases crush their prey. And so those talons are really important for them and kind of make them that predatory bird. So another way to think about this is the word raptor means to seize and carry away, okay? And we really do use that word raptor and bird of prey interchangeably. So essentially, it's any bird that hunts and kills with its feet. Now, there are some groups of thought that say, well, all raptors are birds of prey, but not all birds of prey are raptors. Some people believe that raptors are just a diurnal or a daytime type of raptor, but really these days we use the word interchangeably. This is a great graph that I like to show people, because you'll notice right in the middle there, our vultures and condors are also lumped into that raptors category, even though they don't actually hunt and kill with their feet. The bird above them is a surima. That is another kind of long-legged bird that lives in South America, Bolivia, Brazil, that area, and they have also been lumped into the raptors category now due to some really interesting genetic information that we're finding out. So we kind of use those words interchangeably, and an owl is absolutely a bird of prey. We are so lucky, like I said, here in Colorado, we have 13 owl species that call Colorado home. And so we're going to touch on each one of them today. We have our true owls, the Strigidae family, which, as you can see, is the majority of the owls that we get in that group here in Colorado. And then we have Titanidae, which is the barn owl. Other owls in that category are like the sooty owl, and they're just completely separate in those two families. In North America, we actually have over 19 species of owls that call our continent home, which is pretty amazing. But we're going to focus on the Colorado ones today. So we're going to jump right into it. But first, what makes an owl, right? How are they different from hawks and falcons and vultures, for that matter? Well, they're opportunistic hunters. So they're not necessarily going to be sitting and waiting in the bushes to ambush prey. They're going to be waiting for something to run across their vision or run across wherever they are perched. So they're opportunistic. That means they're going to jump down and react to a vole or a mouse or a rabbit or something else that is in their specific diet. Owls produce owl pellets, of course. They have a really specialized digestive system that actually can't digest fur or bones. So they bring up these pellets, which are the formed contents from all the undigested material. A lot of people always think it's poop, but it's not poop. It's just something that they're bringing up from their stomach, actually. Believe it or not, these guys use hearing more than their vision to hunt. They have asymmetrical ears. Actually, we do too. If you look in the mirror at home, we'll have one ear that's a little higher than the other and one ear that's a little lower than the other. Owls have that too. It's just way more exaggerated. And they actually use those asymmetrical ear openings to triangulate where their prey is in their environment. And that's how they hunt. So even though they have those big old eyes, and we're going to talk about those big old eyes later on today, they primarily hunt by sound. In fact, there are a couple species of owls, we like to say, when we go to noisy school groups and we go into an auditorium full of children, we ask everybody to stay nice and quiet, because one animal in particular, usually it's one of our owls, we tell them that can hear everybody's heart beating. Not sure if that's actually true, but it sure gets the kids to quiet down. They also have these really amazing bony structures called the sclerotic ring. All right, so those rings are those bony complexes that surround the eyeballs, okay? It actually holds the eyeballs in place inside their head. So we are very lucky in mammals that we can move our eyeballs back and forth in our head. Owls cannot. They have no movement because of those bony structures. So they make up for that with additional vertebrae in their neck. So we have 7 vertebrae, 7 neck bones in our neck. These guys actually have 14, and that allows them to rotate their head about 270 degrees. They can't go all the way around. That's an old myth, but they can go about 270 degrees. They really do have amazing eyesight, although not as good as some of us have been taught. They have more rods in their eyes than cones, so they're really good at picking up motion and movement, especially in low light, but they're not as good at seeing color. And they have really poor nearsighted vision. So oftentimes when you feed an owl, they'll stand up really tall and really try hard to see what you're giving them up close to them. It's really interesting. They, of course, have flat feathers on their face, making up that beautiful and incredible facial disc. The barn owl, which is pictured here, has one of the most distinct heart-shaped facial discs that we see. So that's a good indication. And they use that facial disc exactly like a satellite dish. So it funnels sound into their ears, which is really cool. They're also amazing at camouflaging themselves. This is something called cryptic camouflage, and you're going to see this throughout our presentation tonight. These guys have to blend in. These guys have to hide, both to hunt, but also to stay safe from other potential predators. So their cryptic camouflage is very important for them. They also are silent flyers. So they rely on stealth instead of speed for hunting. So on the leading edge of most of these owls, they have the specialized fringing, or the specialized comb-like structure, I like to call it, that kind of cuts through the air or combs through the air, allowing them to fly completely silent. Very incredible. They also have powerful feet, as you can see here on this far left-hand side with this great horned owl. Big, strong, crushing feet. They actually have the ability to ratchet close over their prey, and you won't get them off that prey, even if you want to. So very amazing strength in those feet. They also have what's called zygodactyl toes. I love this word. And basically what that means is they can choose if they have 3 toes in the front and 1 in back, or 2 and 2. And that allows them to position and grab and grasp and hold on to prey or branches or other things like that, however they want. So very specialized for grasping and killing, which is what these guys do. Okay, do we have any quick questions before we jump on? I think I might have seen maybe one question pop up, but now I'm not seeing it, so maybe we're okay. Okay. All right, so let's start with great horned owls. We're going to spend a lot of time on some of the species that we get here in Colorado, and then we're going to kind of just quickly go over some other ones. But I like to spend a lot of time on great horned owls because oftentimes this is the owl that we're going to get to see. This is the most common owl that we get here in Colorado. They're one of the largest owls that we get in Colorado, but also in the country. They're a very heavy-bodied bird. Most common in Colorado, as I mentioned, and they can be found everywhere across our state. These guys can live in all sorts of varied habitats, from the desert to the suburban areas, to the city, to the mountains, to the forest, to the prairie. And we have all of that in Colorado. So amazing adaptation, amazing ability these owls have to live just about anywhere. They have very large feet just about at any age. These guys grow very quickly, and we'll talk about that here shortly. And prior to the presentation, we were talking about how these guys are one of the earliest nesters here in Colorado. We can start seeing babies as early as February, but these guys oftentimes will nest in the middle of December and January, laying those eggs sometimes under, not so much anymore, but sometimes under feet of snow. They have to keep those eggs warm, and then those babies start to hatch in February and March. So pretty amazing. I've already seen a lot of pictures online that we already have quite a few good-sized nestlings out there, and that makes sense since it's early March already. These guys are called the tigers of the sky, and you can see why. They have this beautiful striping along their wings and kind of the orange rusty coloration, giving them that name. Great horned owls are not migratory. They're going to be in our state year round, which is great for us. They have that amazing cryptic camouflage, which they need to stay safe. Because these guys are most active at dawn and dusk, they're what's considered a crepuscular hunter. meaning that these guys are going to be most active during those early daylight hours and those last few hours of dusk before it gets really dark. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So during the daytime, when these guys are sleeping or roosting, they really need to blend in, because even though they're a top predator, there are other animals that will pick on them and bother them, namely crows and ravens and blackbirds in some cases. So they do not like these big predators sleeping, roosting, perching nearby, so they will be relentless and kind of pick on these owls. So it's important for them to blend into their surroundings. It's even more important when they're nesting. So you can really see that cryptic camouflage in action here with this mother great horned owl and her nestling. For great horned owls, the mother will often incubate and feed the young, and so it's up to dad to go find the food, hunt, and then bring food to the babies. Mom will tear it up into little tiny pieces and then feed those nestlings as they get older. These guys don't build their own nests. Most owls don't build their own nests, believe it or not. So great horned owls are going to borrow nests from other birds like red-tailed hawks, crows, and ravens. They're not very picky. They'll even go to smaller nests like magpies. And in some cases, they'll even just drop it like it's hot anywhere. So flower pots are a favorite of theirs, planters, things like that. I have known of great horned owls just laying eggs on people's balconies. And so, anywhere that looks good for them, they can make it work, as you can see with this great horned owl here.
Just real quick.
Yeah, please.
Someone had said they saw a small great horned owl harass and chase a larger one off of its perch on a neighbor's roof. Are the males smaller than the females?
Yes, that's a great question. Generally speaking, for all raptor species, the females are going to be almost always larger than the males. And there's a few hypotheses for this. They have to have the body capacity to create an egg and lay an egg. They also have to be strong enough and fierce enough to protect the nestlings and the nesting area. So that's a couple of potential reasons for the females being larger and in charge. So it's very possible that a large female great horn chased off a male. Maybe they were a mated pair. Maybe he was an intruder coming into their territory. So hard to say, but yeah, that does happen.
And then do they mate for life?
Generally, yes, they do. So they will mate for life. If something does happen to one of the mated pairs, they will take on another mate. That's sometimes a misconception where they're like, oh, they're going to mate for life, but if something happens to the one mate, then they're done. But that's not necessarily the case. So cool. Okay. Great questions, you guys. Keep them coming. Whoops, let's see here. Bear with me 1 second. Got to get rid of the chat screens. Okay, here we go. All right, so nesting and offspring. So we've talked about how they don't build nests. We've talked about the nestlings a little bit. So as they grow, great horned owls can actually get to their full-grown size in about 8 weeks of age. That's pretty incredible. Imagine if a human could reach 6 feet, for example, in just 2 months. So these guys grow very, very fast. They have a steep learning curve as they're growing, as they're learning. But they don't quite get those feather tufts until they're about 10 weeks of age, a little older like that. So they often look like they're wearing a little Mickey Mouse hat or something like that until they get a little older. Another misconception with fledglings, with great horned owls, is that once these guys leave the nest, if they're on the ground, they're stuck on the ground. So we oftentimes get a lot of calls about injured babies or found babies or orphans, but these guys are exceptional climbers. So even if they do fledge and they're on the ground, they're going to be able to climb to safety as long as they are a healthy individual. So I just love showing these pictures because they're excellent in climbing, getting to safety, and staying out of trouble that way. Looks like we have a few questions here.
Yeah, I can ask a couple of them.
Okay, perfect.
Sure.
You know what? I'll defer to you. You can just keep the questions coming as you see appropriate.
So what is the average lifespan?
Yeah, great question. For great horned owls, they're a more long-lived species. In the wild, they only live to be about 12, 13, maybe into their teens. But in captivity, these guys can actually live into their 20s and 30s. The oldest wild great horned owl that I've had the pleasure of working with was 26 years old. He was banded at the Rocky Mountain Arsenal many, many years ago. So it was really cool to get that band information back to see that that owl was just, doing great for 26 years out there. So yeah.
When well, we've heard that there is an owl in Anthem with only one eye. Is that possible for them to hunt and survive?
Absolutely. It kind of depends on the injury that was caused and what happened to that owl. Because they have such large eyes and their eyes are fixed in their head, oftentimes what happens is great horned owls will get fixated on a prey animal, and they won't realize a vehicle is coming, or they won't realize that they're about to collide with a window. And because their eyes are so big, it can sometimes cause pretty significant eye injuries. And in fact, we have a great horned owl in our wildlife hospital right now with an eye injury. So in many cases, because they are primarily hunting by sound, they don't need two eyes to survive in the wild. When it becomes a problem is if the eye gets swollen or it gets infected or something like that. That's when that owl might need help. So yeah, great observations.
Great. I have someone here saying they've heard at least 3 different and distinct calls from great horned owls who live in their yard. How many calls do they have and when do they use them? Is it seasonal? Is it mating?
Yeah, oh God, that's a great question. I don't know how many specific calls that a great horned owl has. We like to say that they are the one true hoot owl. So of course they have that stereotypical hoo 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 call, and the male and the female have very similar tones and communicate back and forth that way. Those are usually during courting season. But the babies make all sorts of crazy noises. So when they feel scared or are defensive, they will clack their beak and it sounds like a typewriter. They can honk like a goose. They can almost meow like a cat. So they make all sorts of different noises. Usually we hear the strangest noises in the late fall. That's the time of year when these juvenile owls are leaving their parents, or actually they're getting the boot, they're getting kicked out of their parents' house. No more free meal ticket for them. And so they'll start making all sorts of desperate calls and making noises to try and get the parents to feed them. So that's usually when we hear the weird noises. So yeah, super great question.
All right, back to you.
All right, sounds good. The other thing, since we were talking about feather tufts and the great horned owl's little tiny feather tufts as they age, that of course is where the great horned owl gets their name from. Those feather tufts on the top of their head. They actually have a really fun word. They're called plumicorns. So think of unicorn and plume, like plumage, and that's what those feather tufts are called, plumicorns. And there's a couple of different reasons scientists think that they have them. And you'll notice most owls have these feather tufts. Some scientists believe that they're used for communication. So oftentimes when they are happy or content, those feather tufts will be up. When they are scared or dismayed, they can pin them to their head. Some scientists believe that they're just strictly for camouflage. And it helps break apart their silhouette in a tree, so predators or other corvids can't see them. So really interesting adaptation, and these little guys don't get their feather tufts until they're just a little bit older. Okay, so what do great horned owls eat? Well, they eat just about whatever they want. They really are the tigers of the sky for that reason. I love this picture because this shows a female great horned owl flying in to feed her young. You can see the little nestling down here at the bottom of that nest. And she's actually bringing her offspring, a yellow-bellied racer snake. This photo was taken on Easter many, many years ago. So there were snakes out and about. It was early spring, and she was feeding her young. But of course, these guys will also eat mammals like voles and mice. Their absolute favorite prey animal are cottontail rabbits. And that's because of their natural history. Great horned owls, like I mentioned, are most active at dawn and dusk. And so is their favorite prey animal. Cottontail rabbits are also most active at dawn and dusk, so it kind of works really well that way. Um, They'll, of course, snack on bull snakes and other reptiles, things of that nature. They've also been known to eat skunks because great horned owls have a terrible sense of smell. They have next to no sense of smell, so a skunk meal is no big deal for them. But it's also important to note that you should keep your cats indoors because these guys will prey on small dogs and cats if left unattended. So, you know, we can't blame them. They're opportunistic and are going to go for an easy meal. Great horned owls are primarily going to eat and hunt during those dawn and dusk hours, but as you can see in this picture, when they have young, they will sometimes hunt and feed, you know, daylight, evening, it doesn't matter. So pretty incredible that way, how they take care of their young. Habitats and ecosystems. So where do these guys live? That's the question I always get is, where can I see the owls? How can I find them? With great horned owls, it's probably the easiest because they are one of the most common owls we get. These guys can live in suburban, urban, and densely populated areas. So they can live in these man-made structures like barns and things like that. But of course, up in our mountains and our forests, our pine forests, we can find them. We will oftentimes see some color variation in them too. The owls that live in the dark pine forest will tend to be a little darker. The birds that live in the plains will be a little more blonde. So they really do have a varied habitat. In our suburban areas, this is a nice deciduous tree, a nice broadleaf tree. There aren't too many of those that are native here in Colorado, except our cottonwood trees and a few others. So these guys also live closely alongside people, like we've been talking about. And then, of course, juniper windbreaks, I think they're also called shelter belts, are excellent places to try and find owls. This time of year is the best time to try and find great horned owls because they are nesting. And you don't have to go on a major hike or a trek out into nature to find them because oftentimes they're sometimes along the roadside or just off of a hiking trail. So look for nests and look for little feather tufts poking out of the nest or tails and things like this. Before the leaves come back in spring really is the best time to look for great horned owls.
And are they very territorial?
Well, they can be. Generally speaking, they are not territorial with people, but they can be very territorial with other great horned owls. Usually those territorial disputes will happen during breeding season. So at the end of fall, early winter, when they're trying to find nesting sites, when they're trying to kind of rebond, recreate those pair bonds, that's when you can get those territorial disputes. Being the most common owl that we get here in Colorado, there's a lot of them. And so there's a lot of room for them to clash and have those territorial disputes. Okay. Any other questions on the great horned owl before we move on to some little guys?
Sure. If we're going to move to off the great horn, let me ask, how large are they?
Great question. I always have a hard time putting them in pounds because I weigh all of our education ambassadors in grams. So these guys can weigh anywhere from like 900 to like 1,800 grams. So about a pound, pound and a half, somewhere in that range. When you see them in person, you think, oh my God, these things are like 5 feet tall and they must weigh like 20 pounds. But really, we have to remember birds have hollow bones. They're mostly that fluffy down feathers. And so that they really are light, only about a pound, pound and a half, somewhere in that neighborhood.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, of course. All right, so we're going to start talking about kind of a miniature version of the great horned owl. The eastern screech owl. These guys are probably the next most common owl that we have the pleasure of seeing here in Colorado. The problem is we almost never see them because of that cryptic camouflage and of course their size as well. They're a really fascinating little owl for a lot of reasons. They're called the eastern screech owls, first of all, because they live anywhere from east of the divide all the way out to the Atlantic Ocean. And so we can find them all over the United States, all over the eastern part of Colorado. I like to think of them as miniature versions of the great horned owl, although they are completely different. You can see they have that amazing kind of silvery gray cryptic look to their plumage. To me, they really look like bark, the bark of a tree. And in particular, they look like cottonwood trees to me. They are capable of moving the feathers on their face. They can move those facial feathers in all different ways to make all sorts of different looks. So they can make themselves puff up and look like a big knot on a tree, or they can shrink themselves up and make themselves look like a little tiny branch. And that helps them camouflage. And the reason that's so important is because not only are these guys ferocious little predators, but they're also prey. So they have to be careful due to their size. These guys are truly nocturnal owls. They are most active at night because they want to avoid when the great horned owls are up. So they're going to be hunting and being most active in those dark hours of the evening after the great horned owl has settled in for a little bit. And really cool, these guys actually come in a gray and red phase, which I'll show you here in just a minute. They also, of course, nest. They're getting ready to nest here in Colorado this time of year. This is the time of year that eastern screech owls are visiting those nesting boxes, visiting those hollows in trees. They also don't build their own nests, so they're going to rely on hollows, holes from woodpeckers that they have made in trees, or man-made nest boxes are really important. And if you look at this owl here, you'd almost never know she was there. This is high up in a park in Littleton. This owl was just roosting and hiding, and you never know she was there if you didn't know what to look for. These guys can have anywhere from like 2 to 5 eggs, and like most bird species, these guys are going to fledge in about 30 days. So this is what the cute little fledglings look like. They're oftentimes very new to their world. They can climb great, just like great horned owls. They're a little lighter than the great horned owls, of course. But these guys, because they were raised in a cavity, oftentimes like a hollow tree or a nest box, when they come out into their world, everything is brand new and they don't always know what the dangers are. So these guys can oftentimes get themselves into a lot of trouble. They end up in a wildlife rehab center because well-intentioned people find them, think that they're injured or orphaned, and because mom and dad are so hard to see, these guys accidentally get bird-napped or kidnapped and brought into facilities like ours. So it's important to note that sometimes being on the ground or just being in a low bush can be normal for these fledglings, especially in the early spring. So what do these guys eat? They are really interesting with what they eat. Because these guys are going to be most active at night, that kind of tells you a little bit about what their diet is going to be. So very similar to the great horned owl, these guys are going to eat voles and mice, of course, lots of mammals in their diet. But these guys have also been known to grab nesting songbirds right out of the tree. So songbirds are active during the day. They're diurnal. And so when they go to their roost spots to sleep at night, screech owls can come in and grab them and eat them, which is pretty fascinating that way. If you think about it, birds are very fast. These little songbirds maneuver really well. So a screech owl may have adapted to just grab them at night instead of try and hunt them during the day. They've also been known to eat crayfish. We have found crayfish exoskeletons in some of the pellets that eastern screech owls create. So we know that they're also jumping down into the water at night in the creeks and the shallow waters to get some of these animals, as well as lizards that they might find as well. So these guys have a very varied diet and even eat and have also been known to eat bats right out of the air. They're highly maneuverable. These guys are probably the micro athlete of the owl world. Similarly to the great horned owl, these guys also have a very wide-ranging ecosystem that they live in. So here we can see the red phase eastern screech owl. They love those old mature forests, I guess you can say. So think of areas like Washington Park, mature areas of Boulder, anywhere where there are mature groves of pine trees or cottonwood trees. That's the habitat these guys love. look at the hollows in the trees. I have had stories, not for me personally, but I have had friends that say, I drive past this cottonwood tree every single day. There's this perfect screech owl shaped hole in that tree. And you know, they look at it every day, and one day she finally saw a screech owl just sitting perfectly in that hole. So if you have hollows in your neighborhood, keep an eye on them. You may find a screech owl in them at some point. But a little more of a deep dive into their ecosystem, into the habitat that they prefer. Screech owls really need to be around water. That seems to be kind of a key into where they choose to live, essentially. So in that top right-hand picture here, we have a really beautiful park with a nice pond there. And you can see kind of these lower scrubby-like bushes or trees. That's the stuff screech owls love. Because it camouflages them really well. They can hide in it. It's dense. But there's also taller trees nearby. And then they have that water. On the picture here on the left, this is actually closer to the foothills, but same kind of habitat. So we have all this weird dry scrub oak. It's kind of hard to see because it's a winter picture. So we have all this low scrub oak that's about 4 to 5 feet tall, and then these nice pine trees. And you can actually see there's a nesting box for screech owls on one of those trees. And hard to see in this picture, but there's just a very small little creek that is kind of a year-round creek that lives on this property. And so fantastic screech owl habitat there. They can live all over the eastern part of our state as well. So they can get higher up into our foothills to about 7,000, 8,000 feet. That might be pushing it a little bit for them, but they can get right up to the foothills and then of course out to the plains as well. And then the western screech owls. A lot of people don't realize we have 2 types of screech owls here in Colorado. So you guessed it, the western screech owl lives on the western slope of the Continental Divide, and their population goes all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. There are a few areas here in Colorado where the populations combine. Pueblo area is an area where you can actually find both eastern and western screech owls. There really aren't great ways to tell them apart. There's a couple little things. They tend to have thicker, darker barring on their bodies, and some of them will have a black beak, but not all of them. Some of them will have a gray beak, just like those eastern screech owls. So the only true way to tell them apart is by their vocalizations. The western screech owl has a completely different vocalization than the eastern screech owl. So pretty fascinating that way. All right. Any questions before we move on?
One of them here, they hear an owl early in the morning. It's very close. Could that be on a roof?
Absolutely. Yeah, you know, it's so hard with owls because they fly silently. So all of a sudden we'll hear that hoot and we're like, gosh, where is that coming from? And so, yeah, they could be on a roof. They could be in a nearby tree. I've had people hear the hoot, walk outside onto their balcony, and then the owl flies off. So they could be pretty close to where you're sitting there.
And one about the origin of their name, and do they screech?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. So it's kind of a misnomer, actually, because screech owls have, well, I should say eastern screech owls have more of a whinny. They sound kind of like a teeny tiny little horse. They don't actually screech. So one theory is, you know, in the early 1800s, when a lot of these birds were being discovered, they actually heard the raspy screech of a barn owl and misplaced it onto the screech owl. So very good question. Very, very good to bring up. But yeah, they don't actually screech. All right, we're gonna keep going here. That way I kind of can keep us on time. We'll see, I'll do my best, guys. So we'll talk about long-eared and short-eared owls. These guys are some of the rare owls that we get here in Colorado. We don't get to see them that often. The long-eared owls are, of course, named for their long ear tufts on the top of their head. They're found in areas with really dense trees, bushes, and those juniper windbreaks or those shelter belts. They're similar in color to the great horned owl, but they're often a little browner, a little more rusty in their tones, and they tend to be a little more slender. longer ear tufts, of course, and kind of a smaller overall size. And so I compare them size-wise to like a crow. So that really gives you an idea where a great horned owl is the size of, I don't know, they're like basketball size in my mind. So basketball compared to like a small crow. And then of course, oh my goodness, you cannot misplace those eyes. If you see an owl with long feather tufts outside, they have those big crazy eyes, probably a long-eared owl. And then we have the delicate short-eared owl, one of my favorite owls that I've had a chance to work with. They have those barely visible ear tufts, but they are there. They're similar in size to that long-eared owl, so they're going to be about the size of a crow. They do live here year-round, like the long-eared owl, but they're going to be more prominent in the winter. We may have some migrating species that come in, or not species, migrating individuals that come in. They rarely nest here in Colorado, but they can nest. Where the long-eared owls are going to nest in abandoned crow nests or magpie nests, short-eared owls actually nest on the ground. They're ground nesters and can often be found around marshes and kind of cattail areas. Like I said, they're a very delicate species. They often float on the air. I compare them to northern harriers. So short-eared owls are going to be most active at dawn and dusk, kind of like our great horned owls. But they kind of float and hunt and fly in a similar way as the northern harrier. So anywhere you can find northern harriers is where these short-eared owls are going to be as well. But they tend to like less populated areas. They don't like a lot of commotion. So they're going to be in more rural areas like that. Feeding habits with these guys. Both of these species are big-time mammal eaters. Being an opportunistic predator, they're absolutely going to go for birds from time to time, small reptiles, things like that. But the majority of their meal is made up of voles and mice and things of that nature. Habitats and ecosystem. This is always the big question, right? So like I said, those short-eared owls are going to be around marshland, anywhere that there's water and some tall grass prairie. Because they're primarily hunting by sound, these guys don't have to see through all that tall grass. They're going to be listening for their prey, which is really important for them that way. That's why they live in these areas. Both species can be found in these big windbreaks, these big shelter belts. Short-eared owls oftentimes will roost on the ground as well, but if you're looking for long-eared owls, and sometimes their habitat overlaps with each other, long-eared owls tend to roost about halfway up into the trees towards the top as well. So kind of right in the middle and continue up a little bit. And you have a great opportunity of finding them if you just kind of take a grid-like approach to kind of looking through these bushes, trying to find them. You don't want to get up close, of course. You don't want to bump a bird during the day, especially a long-eared owl that's going to be more active at night. So we don't want to scare them in the middle of the day where they fly out of a shelter belt like this. Another great picture of areas we have found both species, just anywhere where they have a conglomerate of trees next to like wide open space is where we can find these guys. Kind of, let's see, I'm trying to think of areas near us. Niwot area is a great area to see long-eared owls. Going out east near Bar Lake by the airport, short-eared owls. Pawnee Grasslands is great for short-eared owls, as well as right now it's the time of year where the cranes are coming back to Alamosa way down south. And so lots of marshland down there, lots of great area to see short-eared owls down there. Any questions before we move on to burrowing owls?
Just one in general. A lot of these species are being identified, and you're able to identify them by their ear tufts. Do the ear tufts serve a purpose?
Yep. So we talked about that a little bit with the great horned owls. So great horned owls, of course, are named for their feather tufts or their ear tufts. And so scientists believe there could be two reasons why they have these. One could be for communication. So just like dogs and cats can communicate with body language and their ears, some scientists believe that owls can also use those feather tufts to communicate. When they're up, they tend to be content. When they're pinned to their head, they tend to be more dismayed or uncomfortable or nervous in those situations. but other scientists believe that that's also used, the feather tufts are also used to break apart their silhouette. So if they're roosting or hiding or sitting looking for food, just that break up of a little bit of that bulbous silhouette can help them blend into their area a little more. So those are the two main kind of accepted reasons why they have feather tufts. And as you see with the burrowing owl here, they don't have feather tufts. So we'll talk more about that in a second if there aren't any other questions.
No, go right ahead.
Cool. Okay. So I love to tell people there are no absolutes in nature, right? You can't always say great horned owls always do this, or long-eared owls are always this way, because there's no true absolutes. And so I like to think of the burrowing owl this way. They're kind of an anti-owl in a way. Sometimes people think of owls as nocturnal. Well, burrowing owls are most active during the day. They are a daytime owl. And then if you look at their face, they kind of have a modified facial disc. They don't have that very flat-faced appearance like the barn owl does, or even the great horned owl does. And again, that's because of their natural history, where most owls are using sound to hunt, hearing to hunt. These guys are using their eyes, that they're hunting through vision, because they're a daytime species. So really interesting that way. And this picture is a perfect example of their hunting style. These guys love short grass prairies, and so they're going to perch on kind of the tallest perch they can find, and then they're going to look for bugs and mammals and reptiles and things like that. Of course, these guys are prairie dwellers. These guys are ground nesters. So they live in active prairie dog towns here in Colorado. Oftentimes people think that they live in abandoned prairie dog colonies, and that's not the case, that they live in active colonies. And so that's why those prairie dog populations are so important, because some people are like, heck with those prairie dogs. We don't like prairie dogs. But without the prairie dogs, we don't have burrowing owls. So that's a really important relationship that way. These guys are a migratory species. They're not going to be here year round. And that's because their primary food source are insectivores. That's primarily what they're eating. They're going to eat those invertebrates. And so in the winter, we don't have a lot of bugs here. So they're going to have to migrate south to find some of their more favorite food sources. A little bit about their natural history. A lot of people think that burrowing owls, you can't tell males from females. They're not sexually dimorphic. And that's kind of true, but I like to use a little trick. And this picture is so perfect for that. So if you ever get the opportunity to go out and observe burrowing owls, you'll notice that this bird here on the far right is the female. They tend to be a little darker brown, darker in coloration. And then the bird in the middle, of course, is one of their little nestlings. They tend to be a little more buffy and fluffy colored. And then the bird on the far left is the male. They tend to be a little lighter in coloration, almost more sun-bleached. And that's because they are. If you think about their natural history, burrowing owls lay their eggs and nest in abandoned prairie dog holes. And so that female is going to be underground for the most part, where the male is going to be leaving and feeding her that way. So he's going to get sun bleached. He's going to be out and about more often. So that's a really cool way to tell them apart if you get to observe them in the wild.
And how far down in the nests do they?
Really good question. I'm not 100% sure on that, because there's some conflicting information. I really do believe it depends on the prairie dog hole itself. You know, some are very shallow. Some can kind of curve and go down a little further. From what I have been told is they do go down at least a foot and sometimes further because they want to be out of the reach of predators like badgers, coyotes, and other animals that might eat their eggs and of course their young as well.
And are they at risk of getting the plague from the prairie dogs that were there?
Ooh, you guys are asking some great questions tonight. I love it. The answer is no. These guys, because they are birds, do not have to worry about the plague. So the plague is something that is spread just to mammals. So we can get the plague, of course. Other mammals can get the plague, but luckily for the burrowing owls, birds don't get the plague. The plague is transmitted primarily by fleas. Although, you know, other invertebrates that eat blood can also transmit it. But fleas really prefer those mammal hosts. So they're going to stay on the prairie dogs, coyotes, that sort of thing. And burrowing owls have a higher body temperature than than the prairie dogs do. So we really don't have to worry about that. Fleas don't like to be on the burrowing owls. Excellent question. Okay. So let's talk about these cute little guys. Everybody loves watching burrowing owls. They can have quite big clutches, actually, compared to some of the other owls. Another one of those things that make them anti-owls. They can have anywhere from 5 to 7 young, and I've heard of even more babies from time to time as well. They usually only have 1 clutch of eggs, but sometimes they can double clutch if conditions are good and we're having a long summer or something like that. But you can see these are some juvenile burrowing owls coming out of the burrow. So they come out of the burrow at about 30 days after they've hatched, and they start exploring their surroundings. And these birds get pretty independent pretty quickly compared to some of the other owl species. You can see them getting a little bit older. They'll lounge around because they have their parents nearby. On the far right-hand side, you can see the mother tending to them. And then the mother and father have a really interesting relationship as well. The female, which you can see in this picture, kind of on the far left-hand side, the male is the one that delivers the food, generally speaking. The female will collect food, bugs, insects, things like that around the burrow to feed to their offspring, but that male is working overtime. He's flying back and forth, doing food deliveries to the mom, offering food to the kiddos, that sort of thing. So he's a very busy parent, and he just comes and goes all day long. As far as food habits go, these guys also have a very varied diet. So thinking about the prairie where these guys live, these guys are going to eat a ton of insects, beetles, crickets, grasshoppers, larvae, things of that nature. But they're also little tenacious hunters. So they're also going to eat those voles and mice. And these guys are agile enough to even catch songbirds that are down in the prairie, and small reptiles and things of that nature. They have a really unique relationship with some invertebrates as well. They have been known to find like cow patties or droppings from other animals, and they will collect it and bring it close to their burrow so that it actually causes other invertebrates and other insects like dung beetles to come closer to the burrow. That way they don't have to work as hard and find as much food further away. So really interesting adaptation that they have there. They also have a really unique relationship with their environment. So, you know, we kind of talked about how the short-eared owl, for example, can thrive in that long grass prairie. Burrowing owls cannot. They need that short grass prairie, which is in steep decline here in our country. And so they need that short grass prairie because, one, that's what the prairie dogs prefer, and two, it gives them more vision to see prey, but also predators as well. They heavily rely on those prairie dogs. In fact, they actually have quite the symbiotic relationship going on. They help protect each other's families and each other's burrows. I have with my own eyes watched prairie dogs and burrowing owls together chase off a rattlesnake to get out of their territory, because rattlesnakes would absolutely eat a prairie dog pup, would absolutely eat burrowing owl young as well. So really interesting that way. And speaking of rattlesnakes, these guys also have a really interesting defense mechanism. Burrowing owls have the ability to make a vocalization that sounds exactly like a rattlesnake rattle. And they do this, if you think about it, if a mother burrowing owl is down in her burrow with her young, and there's a coyote up above thinking about sticking its snout into that burrow, if she makes that noise that sounds like a rattlesnake, that coyote is going to think twice about putting his snooter in that hole. So really interesting adaptation they have that way. Do you guys have any questions on burrowing owls before we move on? And are we doing okay on time? I'm going to go over tonight. I hope that's okay.
No, that's not a problem. Keep going. This is wonderful.
Okay, cool. All right, so now we're going to talk about some of my favorite, the small mountain owls, or the small forest owls, you can think of them. That's the flammulated owl, the pygmy owl, northern saw-whet owl, and the boreal owl. So we're going to kind of do a deep dive into these guys because we don't get to see these guys that often. These guys are the winners when it comes to cryptic camouflage. So we'll start with the northern saw-whet owl. Most people think this is the cutest owl that lives here in Colorado. And these guys are really fascinating. We are still learning as scientists and biologists, we're still learning about the northern saw-whet owl. They have very fascinating migration patterns that we're still trying to figure out what that's all about. For example, I have banded northern saw-whet owls here in Colorado that migrated to New Jersey for the winter. What's up with that? It's not any warmer there. In fact, it might be colder. So they have a really strange migration pattern, but they live in our state year-round. So even though they're a migrating species, they're just migrating kind of in a checkerboard pattern, kind of around our state. So we can find these guys here year-round. In fact, we just released one that was in our rehabilitation center just a few weeks ago that was found in the area. So these guys are going to prefer our mountain forests, our foothills, but can be found in lower elevations as well, especially our suburban areas like Arvada, Lakewood, Broomfield for sure is a great place to find saw-whet owls. These guys are also a truly nocturnal owl. So these guys are going to be most active when it's super dark, because again, they're tiny. So not only are they a very ferocious predator, but they're also prey. And so they know that. They instinctively know that they have to protect themselves that way. They're known for their bright yellow eyes that can sometimes, depending on their diet, get deep orange. They're a small owl with a big head. They kind of look like a little old lady that wears a bonnet, I feel like. The adults have this beautiful kind of brown and white barring on their chest. And they have these very soft, short, delicate little wings that help them kind of float through the forest. So these guys prefer more of a dense forested area. But they have been known to seek shelter in garages, kind of open lofting sheds for horses, barns, things of that nature, especially when weather is really bad. These guys are also cavity nesters. Another animal that oftentimes get demonized is the northern flicker and woodpeckers because they put holes in our houses and they drive us crazy in some cases. But again, without these guys, we wouldn't have these little tiny forest owls because these guys make the perfect nesting cavity for the northern saw-whet owls. And they nest at different times a year. So it's really kind of a beneficial relationship for everybody in that sense. So the offspring actually look quite a bit different from the adults. So the two kind of chocolate-colored owls on the left-hand side are immature or juvenile saw-whet owls. These guys kind of start out life kind of dark chocolate with that beige tummy, and over their first few months will slowly start to transition to their adult plumage, which is like the bird on the right-hand side. You'll also notice with these guys, they don't have feather tufts. Instead, they have a modified facial disc that kind of have two humps at the top that kind of is their version of the feather tufts. And they have that modified facial disc for that reason. So very cute little owls. Very interesting. We're still learning more about these little guys. There's lots of migration studies going on with these guys right now because there's a lot to learn. Very similar to the northern saw-whet owl is the boreal owl. So
real quick before you move on, is there any information on where did that name come from?
Oh, yes. Sorry, I always, for some reason, kind of just breeze past the name for these guys. So the northern saw-whet owl, biologists and ornithologists aren't very creative. You'll learn with a lot of things that they pick pretty boring names. So the saw-whet name comes from their vocalization. It sounds like a wet saw, or when somebody is wetting a stone to sharpen a saw. So not very exciting, but that's where the name comes from. All right, any other questions? Looks like we're good.
No, go.
Cool, sounds good. All right, so I usually do these two species together because they are very closely related. So the northern saw-whet owl and the boreal owl, very closely related. They're about the same size, which I would say the saw-whet owls are about the size of a robin, and the boreal owls are just slightly larger, okay? So our saw-whet owls live in our foothills and kind of lower down into our suburban areas that are right outside of the foothills. The boreal owls are going to be our high alpine forest owl. These guys don't like a lot of commotion. They don't like being around people. So think of these guys in areas like Rocky Mountain National Park, Centennial Cone Park, kind of higher elevation foothills. Right before we get to our big mountains is where these guys are going to be. They're a very secretive owl. We don't oftentimes get the chance to see these guys. They're very similar to the saw-whet owl as far as their youngsters go. Their youngsters tend to be almost kind of a blackish brown. And you'll notice with the boreal owl young, and if I go back a couple pictures to the saw-whet owl young, notice they have the really interesting white X on their face. I like to think of it as X marks the spot. Because if you think of it, these guys are going to be being raised in cavities. It's really dark in those cavities. So some researchers believe that that white X kind of tells mom and dad where to put the food in those dark nesting cavities, which is really interesting. So we can see that somewhat on this boreal owl youngster as well. These guys are going to primarily be eating mammals. Oops, I don't want to go ahead yet. These guys are going to be primarily eating mammals. They're not as agile as the eastern screech owl, so they're not going to be picking off as many birds. A lot of voles, depending on what part of the country or the continent they're in, they may also eat lemmings, mice, things like that. They're not agile enough to get bats either, so they're pretty much stuck with the mammals in their forested areas. Okay. Any questions on these guys before we move on? Cool. All right, one of my other favorite owls to talk about is the Northern Pygmy Owl. This is another anti-owl because these guys are going to be most active during the day. And so again, what you'll notice with this owl and the owls that are most active during the day, they don't have much of a facial disc. I always like to tease people, these guys are super ferocious predators. Even though they're only about the size of a pine cone, we are lucky that they are the size that they are. Otherwise, we would be on the menu too. These guys are just super feisty, super tenacious, very gregarious little birds. We can also find these guys in our high alpine forest. So again, they're going to kind of have mixed use with our northern saw-whet owls and our boreal owls, but they're going to be most active during the day, whereas the boreals and the saw-whets are going to be most active at night. So these guys eat, like I said, just about everything. They, again, are going to be most active during the day. These guys are so agile that they'll hang out in broad daylight at the top of a pine tree, and they don't have a care in the world. If a bird comes to bug them, they're fast enough to get out of the way that they're really not bothered by much. They're also a cavity nester. They love aspen trees. Aspen forest or kind of mixed use forests where we have pine trees and aspen is a great place to find pygmy owls. They oftentimes, because there's so much out in the open, will come into wildlife rehab. They'll get hit by a car, they'll chase a bird into a window, and that's oftentimes why we see these little guys. But I love this picture because for their small size, they have some of the largest feet of any owl for their size. So pretty incredible that way. They're also, like I said, they'll eat just about anything. Pygmy owls have been known to eat birds about 3 times their size. So think about that for a second. These guys are incredibly strong, incredibly fast, and they primarily eat birds. That's why they're out during the day. These guys are out and about looking for songbirds that they can pick out of the pine trees. But like any owl, these guys are also going to be opportunistic. So they're going to eat our mice, like we can see this kiddo here, voles. Those birds, of course, are not safe from the pygmy owl, and things of that nature. That they'll eat small reptiles from time to time as well. But when you think about their location, high elevation, we're not going to get a lot of reptiles up there. These guys can also eat larger mammals like chipmunks. So for their size, just a little tiny strawberry, a little tiny pine cone of a bird, these guys can eat big meals. Really interesting that way. And then their ecosystem. So think of those higher elevation forests that have some nice meadowy areas in them. Where I have heard them and seen them is around Estes Park, Rocky Mountain National Park, kind of those higher elevation areas. And so look for birds at the tippy top of those pine trees. So kind of like dead center in this picture. They will perch right up top in the middle of daylight, like they don't have a care in the world. And that's the best way to find them. All right, let's see here. I think we are, oh, we have one more. Any questions before you move on to my favorite little owl? No, I think we're good. All right, so the flammulated owl, I'll catch you guys ahead of time. They get their name from the flame-like coloration on their wings. So that's where the word flammulated comes from. These guys are the smallest owl that we get here in Colorado. They only weigh, like on the low end, about 42 grams, so itty bitty little birds. They are the smallest dark-eyed owl in the United States. So, but definitely for sure the smallest owl in Colorado. So look at that cryptic camouflage. Is that not amazing? These tiny owls can blend in perfectly. And you can see those feather tufts, they could put it right up into that crevice of the tree. And gosh, you'd never know that that little owl was there ever. So they're incredibly hard to find, unfortunately, but quite an amazing little species. These guys are also a migrating species. They will migrate all the way down to Mexico for the winter. They usually will leave in early fall, late fall to get down south because these guys are primarily going to eat insectivores, or excuse me, insects and invertebrates. But they have a really interesting migration pattern on the way back up. So in the early spring, right around this time, actually, right around March, they will migrate back up to about New Mexico, and then they just wait. They'll just sit there in a holding pattern until the Colorado weather just gets a little bit warmer, snow starts to melt a little more, and then they come into the States. Really interesting that way. We're learning a lot of really cool things about these owls. They are tiny, like I said. So when they come into rehab, they're itty bitty, they're very delicate. All their features are delicate, from their beak to their feet, everything. You can see that beautiful flame-like pattern on their shoulders there and those big, dark, black eyes. Some scientists believe that the only true nocturnal owls that we have black eyes. So that makes up the flammulated owl here in Colorado and the barn owl. All the other owls you'll notice that we've talked about tonight have yellow eyes, yellow irises. And so some scientists believe that those birds have a better ability to hunt during dawn and dusk, or even in the daylight hours if needed, where the barn owl and the flammulated owl are true, like hunt in the dark of night type owls. So kind of an interesting little anecdote there. There's another picture of a little teeny one. Just amazing little birds for what they do. These guys fledge in the middle of night as well. So their youngsters will spend the first 20 or so days in the nest, again, very similar to the eastern screech owl, not knowing a lot about life outside of that nest cavity. And then they will launch anywhere from about 10 p.m. to midnight. I've had the pleasure of working with some field biologists on some flammulated owl studies that go on. And so I've had the pleasure of watching these little tiny youngsters fledge in the middle of the night. Their parents are incredibly agile hunters. It's really interesting. They're actually very moth-like with how they fly, and their primary source of food is moths. So really interesting. During the summer, they can just pick up hundreds of them, in the course of a week or so. Pretty amazing that way. They're, of course, cavity nesters, like we've already talked about. They prefer ponderosa pine forests, is what I have been told. But they have also been known to really prefer burn scar areas. So it really, we've talked a lot about the Estes Park area tonight, and we all know that they've had some terrible fires go through there this last year. So it'll be really interesting to see what, in particular, these owl species do in those areas. But at least for one species, the flammulated owl, they seem to do really, really well in those burn scars. So yeah, cute little cavity nesters that way. So again, we need those woodpeckers. If you like flammulated owls, we need those little woodpeckers and northern flickers. This is a perfect example of prime flammulated owl habitat. Lots of down trees, lots of old snags, which have lots of hollows in them. Fresh pine trees in the area as well. This was probably an old burn scar at some point that is coming back. Okay, looks like we had a question before we move on. Maybe not. Oh.
All right, yeah. Did the flammulated owls population increase during the Miller moth explosions?
That's a wonderful question. I don't know the answer to that. A lot of predator and prey relationships are cyclical. So we'll see like big coyote explosions when we've had good cottontail years, or vice versa. And then sometimes, well, we won't get into the coyote discussion tonight, but you do see some cyclical relationships when it comes to predator and prey. So I don't know if in those years where we have those big Miller moth eruptions, does that help the flammulated owl populations? I would assume so. But the Miller moths also go on a migration. So they're moving east to west. And so I wouldn't be surprised if by the time they get to our foothills and things like that, I bet you anything it would be right around the time that the flammulated owls are having their young. So really great question. I'll have to look into that. All right. So just a couple more owls. The snowy owl. They are a rare visitor here in Colorado, right? They're an uncommon winter visitor. We actually have 2 in our state right now that I know of, and there could be more for that matter. They, especially the juveniles, will migrate south during the winter because this is an Arctic species. And so the winters up there are very harsh, and they are going to migrate south where the food is a little easier to get a hold of. We've had a couple eruption years. We had a really big eruption year, snowy owls in 2012. We also had another big one in 2015. But every year we get a slow trickle of a few snowy owls here in the state. I like to talk about conservation a little bit, so we'll touch on that. This was the owl that was seen near Broomfield a couple years ago, right around Christmas. This was the Westminster owl that was seen in near Stanley Lake. Oftentimes the juvenile birds will have kind of blacker splotches on them next to that kind of stark bright white. The females can also look very similar. They tend to have darker spots on them. And then the males tend to be just more white overall. And some of them can actually be like completely white. So beautiful owls. These guys are built for cold weather though. They basically have snow boots on. They have these huge feathers that just wrap around all of their feet and their talons, and their plumage is really thick. So very amazing birds. But because of this, they often get themselves into trouble. And because they're rare here in Colorado, we humans aren't always the kindest to them. So this is kind of where I get on my soapbox and say, if you guys are photographers, it's very important that we use the best ethics possible to keep our subjects safe. The first time I ever photographed a snowy owl was here in Colorado. It was out by Barra Lake near DIA, and I was disgusted at how many photographers were chasing this poor bird around. There was at least 30 photographers, and they'd all rush up to the spot, start taking pictures of the owl. The owl would fly off. They'd all get back in their cars and drive off to the next spot. So by the time I finally got to the bird, that's the picture that I was willing to take, because I was not willing to do that bird a disservice by getting too close to it. For years, we thought snowy owls were diurnal. We thought they were most active during the day. And so it was no big deal if photographers were taking pictures of them because we were all going to go away at night and they were going to be able to relax. But what we're now learning, because this is an Arctic species, these guys are both active during the day and at night. So they're hunting during the day and at night, because if you think about it, up on the Arctic Circle, they have long periods of time that are just strictly nighttime. And then they have long periods of time where it's just strictly daytime all the time because of where they are on the planet. And so it's so important, you guys. The one thing you can't see in this picture is just outside of the picture to the right, there's 30 photographers there lined up on private property, I must add, trying to get pictures of this bird. In 2012, 2 snowy owls were killed. They were hit by cars because photographers bumped them into traffic trying to get pictures of them. So it's really important with any owl species, but especially the snowy owl, that we are respectful of their space, respectful of their natural history. If you want to get out there and be a good birder or a good photographer, do some research first and learn about these animals. That way we don't accidentally cause them harm. All right. We do have a couple other rare birds that we get here in Colorado. The 2 other rare owls that we get that are in that Strigidae family are the barred owl and the spotted owl. The spotted owl can be found in areas around Canyon City. Phantom Canyon is known for having spotted owls in them. There's parts of the Western Slope, Dolores Canyon, and areas around Gateway where they can be found. But most of the areas where these birds can be found are kept completely secret because they are endangered. The Mexican spotted owl is an endangered species. So if you find any spotted owls, please keep that location to yourself. And then, of course, the barred owl. There are small pockets in Colorado, especially on the eastern plains, where we can get barred owls. In fact, there was actually a sighting a couple of years ago in Broomfield, believe it or not, of a barred owl. And somebody had a photograph and was able to tell us exactly where it was. So they do come into the state, but it's very rare. So both of these are very rare owls. And last but not least, we have our barn owl. This is almost everybody's favorite owl. I love these guys. Again, a true nocturnal species with those super black eyes. And of course, I had to use a picture of one of them in a barn because that's where they love to be, right? They're primarily known for that perfect heart-shaped facial disc. I mean, that's just so perfect for who they are, what they are. They tend to have more white undersides, those dark black eyes. They're mainly here in Colorado, spring through fall. But we're one of the few areas of the country where populations are doing really, really well. These guys can actually breed here year round. And they are kind of the rabbits, the bunny rabbits of the owl world. They can just produce all the time, which is really interesting because in other parts of the country, these guys are actually threatened, and in some places they're endangered. Barn owls were persecuted in the early 1800s and 1900s because of that scream. So going back to the screech owl, these guys have a very harsh, raspy screech. It almost sounds like an espresso machine. And so if you can imagine seeing a ghostly white owl, oh, maybe you don't know it's an owl, it's a ghostly white being screaming at you coming out of a barn at night. A lot of people thought they were banshees. A lot of people thought they were demons, believe it or not, and they were actually killed and went extinct in certain parts of our country, especially down south. So we're very lucky here in Colorado that we have a robust population of barn owls. The females tend to be a little darker, as you can see here. This is a very extreme example of sexual dimorphism in barn owls. The males tend to be nice and white, and the females tend to be really dark. They almost have purple light colors in their face. But then you can kind of have everything in between, and there can be a little overlap. So you can't always use that to sex barn owls. These guys, of course, are cavity nesters. These guys love big hollows or man-made structures. Unfortunately, in most parts of our country, all of those big trees have been cut down, torn down, or have aged out. So it's really helpful to these species to have those man-made nest boxes. So you can see they are prolific with that. The picture on the far left was actually taken in Broomfield, so we can get barn owls in Broomfield as well. It's just pretty rare, unfortunately. They're really interesting how they lay their eggs and kind of their adaptations for survival that way. They have some of the largest clutches of any of the owls we've talked about tonight. It's common for them to have 5 to 7 eggs, but I have seen them have up to 10 eggs at a time, and they can even double clutch after that. And so what they do, and most owls do this, but it seems more extreme with the barn owls, is they will lay an egg every 2 days. So if you have 7 eggs, that's a 14-day difference from the oldest baby to the youngest baby. And so you can really see that on this picture on the far left here. We have an older sibling right next to a freshly hatched sibling. So pretty amazing that way. They look very vulturine, don't they? They look like little Skeksis or vultures, I think, when they're younger. And then they get that beautiful facial disc as they age. They also have a very diverse prey buffet, really. They can eat animals up to the size of cottontail rabbits, but they are mammal specialists. They're going to eat voles and lemmings and mice and things of that nature. But they've also been known to take snakes, believe it or not, and roosting songbirds as well. But when you have that many mouths to feed, you're going to go for the bigger prey items if you can. These guys, very similar to the short-eared owl, long grass prairie, okay? Any areas that are open, that butt up to some trees or butt up to a suburban area is where these guys are gonna thrive. If you go out east at all, they love those hay barns that are kind of open air. But again, because these guys are nocturnal specialists, they're gonna be hunting by sound. And look how long those legs are. So those legs and everything about these birds are perfectly adapted to dropping down on small mammals that they can hear in the grass. So pretty cool that way. Let's see, I think this might be my last. Yeah, any questions on any of our species we've talked about before we move on to some of our last minute little conservation things? We're on the home stretch. I'm sorry, I've gone over, but we're a few minutes from being done. So here we go. So I like to talk about conservation and just concerns that owls experience from time to time. This time of year, we get a lot of calls about orphan babies, and we've kind of talked about that already. Great horned owls are amazing climbers. So if you find a fledgling or a nestling on the ground and aren't sure if it should be there, call a wildlife professional. You can call us, text us at Nature's Educators. We're more than happy to help you guys. There's multiple amazing raptor centers throughout the state that you can also reach out to as well. But sometimes a healthy baby is normal, but sometimes there's subtle things we can't see or that the public can't see. And those babies need to come into a wildlife rehab center. But there's also some other issues as well. These guys oftentimes get hit by a car, like I mentioned. These guys have eyes fixed in their heads, so they often don't see traffic coming. They get stuck in barbed wire fences. They eat people's chickens, and they can get rodenticide poisoning as well. I went through those really quick because those are very sad pictures, and I didn't want you to have to stare at the sad pictures for too long. But there's a lot of things that we can do to help these owls with some of these issues. So what can we do to help? Well, instead of using rodenticide, which is a primary killer of all raptor species, just use snap traps. These are my favorite mouse traps because they're not scary. You don't have to mess with the scary, snappy metal bars. This is just really easy. It's one button and it's set. And you don't ever have to get your fingers near the nasty parts. These are the best way to control pests in and around your house because really we want the natural predators like owls to be there because they're also going to help with pest control. So please don't use rodenticide if you can help it. Another thing that a lot of people do is they think they're helping wildlife by throwing that apple core out of their car. But just like we saw in the last sad picture, what happens is that brings small mammals to the roadside. So in a way, you are helping wildlife by bringing those small squirrels and mice and whatnot to the roadside. But what we don't realize is we're then bringing predators to the roadside. So those owls, remember, they get so fixated on those prey animals, they're not paying attention to the oncoming cars. They can't physically see those oncoming cars because of the way those bony rings hold their eyes in place. So don't throw food out of your car. That's something easy every single one of us can do. Another big one is please keep your cats indoors. I have cats, I'm a cat lover, but these guys are one of the worst invasive species for killing birds in our state and in our country. I think it's something like over 3 billion birds have been killed by house cats. And some of those cute little flammulated owl pictures I showed you, that was a cat attack, flammulated owl. Because a lot of these youngsters just don't know what predators are yet. It leaves them being easy targets. So all those tiny little owls that we love oftentimes get preyed upon or injured or even killed by cats. So if you can, please keep your cat indoors. We have some awesome resources on our website for training cats, for other things you can do for keeping them indoors, because we understand it can be a pain to keep a cat that is used to going outside inside. So we get it. You can also create habitat for these guys. We've talked a lot tonight that most of these owls don't build their own nests. They're going to beg, borrow, and steal to find nesting areas. So why not put some man-made structures up? Nature's Educators has an initiative this year to build nesting boxes. These are some of ours to create habitat for some of our small owls like screech owls, northern saw-whet owls, and then we also do kestrels as well. So reach out to us if you want nesting boxes. We're probably going to miss out on the window for this year, but if we can get them up, there's always a chance you'll get owls next year. So creating habitat is a wonderful thing you can do. We've talked a little bit about this already. This is the time of year. This presentation was actually perfectly planned for today. I don't think we did it that way, but this is the time of year where great horned owls are in the nest. Pretty soon they're going to be leaving the nest, and they're going to be everywhere, all over our neighborhoods and backyards. And so this is a great infographic. You can find this on our Facebook page and our website as well for, what birds really need help, which ones can just stay here. We don't want to bird nap anybody, but we also don't want to leave anybody that's sick out in the open. So this is a great infographic for that. And of course, you can always reach out to us. We want to be a resource for you guys. So reach out to us at Nature's Educators for questions, owl questions. We love ID questions. So if you have a strange bird or owl and you need help identifying it, send us an email. We love that sort of thing. But you can also do in-person programs. We have a huge ambassador force of educational animals that can't be released back into the wild. So we can do in-person presentations with some of our owls and ambassadors and other birds, or virtual presentations like this. So keep us in mind for those things. And of course, as time goes on, if you find an injured or orphaned bird or raptor, please don't hesitate to reach out with questions to us. That's what we're here for. If you love this presentation and want to learn more about owls in more depth, one of my favorite books is the Peterson Reference Guide to Owls of North America. And then there's a handful of websites, including our own here. And then I just wanted to say thank you to the City of Broomfield and Broomfield Open Space for putting this on tonight. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the presentation and learned something.
Oh, and thank you so much. This was absolutely amazing. And we had over 75 people on here. I think I had one report of, several on the YouTube watching the stream, and I don't know how many we had on Facebook. So we had just an incredible crowd tonight. So I was glad to have you be able to answer as many questions as we were able to.
Oh, yeah. No, it was wonderful. Well, thank you guys so much for having me. I'm happy to answer any last minute questions you guys have. I know I went over, but I'm happy to do whatever you guys need.
I've got just a few more from people.
Oh, awesome.
So do the great horned owls, will they double clutch? I know you said that most of them will, but just one question specifically on the great horned owl.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that answer specifically. Not all owls will double clutch. The barn owl for sure. We have seen regularly do that here in Colorado. General rule of thumb is if conditions are good and prey availability is abundant, you always have that opportunity. I haven't commonly heard about it in great horned owls, but I'm not saying it's not possible.
Great. And what is the lifespan of the barn owl?
Ooh, that's a good question. They live into their late teens, generally speaking. So
Great.
it's kind of different with parrots. You know, in parrots, the bigger parrots live longer, but in raptors, it's not always that way. So even though they're kind of a larger size raptor, they don't live as long as the great horned owl, for example.
Great, thank you. And I noticed you've got your website still up here, natureseducators.org. On behalf of Broomfield Open Space Foundation, I'm glad to say that we've made a $100 donation to you guys as well.
Thank you.
And thank you to the city and county of Broomfield Open Space for helping to enable these as well. This has been absolutely fantastic. For those of you guys who have liked this, we do have 2 more presentations coming up next month. On April 7th, we have a Coyotes at Broomfield, and I know there was a coyote question that happened in the question and answers that we didn't get to, but there is more information about coyotes coming up. That's on April 7th. And then on April 28th, we have the Summits, Songs, and Science Project. And that should be really interesting about a group that's the goal is to climb the 100 highest peaks in Colorado, the 50 state high points, the 7 summits. And I think a lot of you guys know about kind of those challenges that are out there. Some really great things coming up. This has been absolutely fantastic. Thank you again, Emily. Again, please one more time for people that might have missed or were trying to write down that website in case they wanted to go on and get information or donate to you as well.
Absolutely. Yep. Our website is www.natureseducators.org. We're a nonprofit, so any donations go right back to our animal ambassadors and our wildlife patients that are trying to go back to be released. So thanks, guys.
Great. Thank you so much. Absolutely wonderful. I know we have tremendous amount of great horns around Broomfield. I see them in my tree. So, you know, always keep those lookout. Every morning I wake up, I look out because sometimes they're in the tree, sometimes they're not. But, you know, thank you everyone for attending and look forward to speaking with everyone again later.
Sounds good. Thanks, guys. Have a good night.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you so much. Great job.
Thank you. Well, you guys have a good night, and sure we'll talk soon.
Thank you very much.
All right. Take care, you guys. Have a great night.